They were meals made under fire, eaten in silence, and forgotten on purpose, because remembering meant tasting the war all over again. What kind of food kept a soldier alive when hope was the first thing to run out? Ham and lima beans, known by the unforgettable nickname Ham and Mothers, was a dish that soldiers learned to dread. It came in a tin, dense with fat, pale beans and strips of processed ham swimming in a congealed mess. It was technically food, but many claimed it was a cruel joke packed in metal. In foxholes and field tents, it became the butt of jokes, traded away or buried in the mud. Yet it stuck around for decades, reliable, calorie-dense, and impossible to forget. The beans were mushy, the ham tasted like it had died twice, and yet it was a lifeline for men who had nothing else. Veterans would speak of it with a grimace, but also a strange fondness, because in the darkest moments, that little can meant survival. For every man who opened it, held his nose, and swallowed, it became part of the war inside them. Even now, the very mention of ham and mothers brings back a flood of memories, some funny, some haunting, none of them bland. No one eats it now, and maybe that is the point. It was not meant for peace, it was made for war. It was food that reminded you where you were, what you faced, and that somehow you were still alive. It was horror in a can, but also home in a pinch. Spam and potatoes in mess kits was a meal born out of necessity, but remembered like a strange comfort. Soldiers learned to slice up their government-issued spam, toss it into a mess tin, and mash in the powdered potato mix with hot water. It was salty, greasy, and weirdly satisfying, especially after days on the move. The pink gelatinous meat would fry up with crispy edges if you had time and a flame, and the potatoes, well, they were better than nothing. It was not gourmet, but it was hot, and it tasted like someone tried. In the cold, in the rain, after a long march, soldiers would crowd around a small fire, spoons clanking in aluminum pans, steam rising like a promise. It was a small moment of warmth in a cold, mechanical war. Today, that smell of fried spam and starchy potatoes could transport a veteran right back to the battlefield, to a place where comfort was rare and food was survival. We do not make spam and potatoes in mess kits anymore. But back then, it was enough. It had to be. For many, it was the first hot bite in days, and sometimes the last before the fighting resumed. It filled your gut, slowed your hands, reminded you for just a minute what home might have felt like. Hardtack and black coffee was not a meal. It was a test of willpower. Soldiers in World War II inherited this brutal bite from the Civil War, where it was nicknamed tooth dullers and sheet iron crackers. Made of flour, water, and nothing else, hardtack was designed to last forever. It did. Soldiers would bang them on rocks to soften them, dunk them in black coffee to soak the edges, or smash them into crumbs with the butt of a rifle. Together, these two made for a no-nonsense, punishing breakfast that did its job. In the trenches or jungle, men would chew through both like survival depended on it, because it did. There was no sweetness, no joy, just fuel. Sometimes the coffee was barely warm, poured from dented tin pots, bitter as regret. The hardtack tasted like scorched air and cardboard, but it kept a man alive. Now the hardtack has vanished into museums and dusty ration kits, and the coffee has gone soft with sugar and cream. But once, this meal kept tired hands steady and heavy eyes open. It scraped your teeth, burned your throat, and reminded you every bite that this was not home. It was the front line, and nothing came easy. No one misses it, but no one forgets it either. Boiled cabbage and salt pork was the kind of meal that made the whole base smell like war. Cheap, humble, and endlessly filling, it was a favorite for cooks tasked with feeding hundreds on tight rations. Large pots would bubble with chopped cabbage and salty chunks of pork belly or fatback, producing a steam that hung in the air like fog. There were no spices, no finesse, just boiled leaves and salt. The cabbage would turn limp and pale, the pork gelatinous and strong. Soldiers joked that you could smell it a mile away. Still, when the cold wind came through the tents or trenches, This heavy, greasy dish stuck to your ribs, and when they were full, they would sit in silence, eating it fast before it cooled. Sometimes it gave men gas, other times it gave them pause. Was this really food? But it was hot, it was heavy, and it was better than going hungry. These days, you will not find boiled cabbage and salt pork on any menu. It belonged to a different world, where full stomachs came before flavor. Back then, dinner was a tool, not a treat. It did not have to taste good. It just had to last. Powdered egg omelets were a morning miracle and a running joke at the same time. The eggs came in olive drab tins, fine yellow powder that smelled faintly of sulfur, dust, and whatever had been stored nearby. To make them edible, you mixed the powder with water and whatever else you had. Bits of canned ham, dried onions, maybe a slice of toast if you were lucky. The result was a gooey, bright yellow mass that somehow passed for an omelet. It wasn't fluffy or flavorful, but it was hot. And when you were cold, damp, and had not slept right in 3 days, a hot meal counted for everything. Soldiers cracked jokes about it constantly, calling it spackle or egg sponge, but they still cleaned their plates. You had to eat it fast before it cooled and turned into a chewy yellow slab. Some said it tasted like regret, others like cardboard with a pinch of salt. But it filled your stomach. That mattered more than taste. The smell of powdered eggs cooking in a battered mess kit clung to tents and uniforms alike. And for all its faults, it brought men together in those early, groggy hours. They would complain, swap horror stories, and still look forward to it the next day. It was not elegant, and it was definitely not gourmet, but it reminded soldiers of home, or at least the distant memory of one. In that way, it did what it needed to do. C-ration chocolate discs were not dessert. They were punishment with a calorie count. Officially known as D-ration bars, these dense chocolate bricks were issued to soldiers as high-energy emergency rations. But they were no Hershey's. Made with cocoa, sugar, and oat flour to slow consumption, they were intentionally hard to chew, bitter in taste, and more useful as paperweights than snacks. Sometimes the bar came melted and fused to its waxy wrapper. Other times it was so hard you needed a knife to get through it. Troops learned to shave bits into boiling coffee to make it drinkable or gnaw on chunks like bitter jerky. Still, it was chocolate, or at least something close. When you were cold, tired, and dazed from anything resembling real food, that ugly brown bar suddenly became treasure. Some men hoarded them, others traded them. A few even claimed to like them, though that was rare. The sugar helped boost energy during long marches, and psychologically, it reminded you of better things. Candy bars back home, ice cream, civility. In the mud and the fear, that hard, chalky disc was a strange comfort. Today, soldiers have energy gels and protein bars with flavors like mocha latte or peanut butter crunch, but nothing feels as raw or as real as the D-bar. It was bitter. It was weird. And it was unforgettable. Canned macaroni with meat sauce sounded like a warm, comforting meal until you opened it. Inside the drab metal can was a thick, gloppy mixture of overcooked elbow noodles floating in a reddish-orange sauce with tiny flecks of meat that looked like they had given up long before the can was sealed. Issued widely during the Korean War and into Vietnam, this meal was part of the infamous C-ration set. Troops joked it was school lunch from hell, but they ate every bite. It could be heated over a small burner, or if no time or fuel was available, eaten cold straight from the can. The texture was soft and grainy, with a faintly metallic tang from the can itself. But when you were exhausted, freezing, and 1,000 miles from any other comfort, that mushy pasta became something more. It was calories. It was warmth. It was something to hold on to. Some veterans recall it with disgust. Others, weirdly, miss it, not for the taste, but for what it meant. A hot meal in a chaotic place, a reminder that someone somewhere was still trying to keep you alive. Today, MREs are sleeker, tastier, and easier to carry. But that macaroni in a can? It was part of the experience. It was a lukewarm hug from the military-industrial complex. And it worked, more or less. Peanut butter and cracker pack was the loner's lunch, simple and strange in its own right. Found in K rations and C rations alike, it came with a dry cracker disc and a pouch or can of oily peanut butter. But at its core, it was just you, the crackers, and that thick spread sticking to the roof of your mouth. It was hard to eat quickly. You had to sit with it, chew it down, sip some water, and keep going. There was something humble about it. No heat required, no mess, just calories and silence. Soldiers liked it because it traveled well, and in the middle of nowhere it tasted like home. These days, peanut butter still shows up in modern MREs, but the crackers have changed, the packaging is new, and the feeling is gone. This was a quiet meal for loud days. Corned beef hash from a can was greasy, salty, and oddly beloved by soldiers trudging through European mud. The can would hiss open with a whiff of canned meat and potato, grayish-pink and speckled with fat. You dumped it into a hot pan and waited for it to sizzle. Sometimes it crisped up, sometimes it just slumped. Either way, it was food. Hearty, heavy, and packed with energy, it filled your belly and clung to your bones. Soldiers would joke that it tasted like salt and regret, but no one turned it down. On cold mornings or late nights, it was comfort, a reminder that you were still alive. Some would even hoard it, swapping cigarettes or soap to get an extra can. Today, corned beef hash still exists on grocery shelves, but it is clean, it is neat, it is not the same. That old version had grit. It belonged to men who ate with one hand and held a rifle in the other. Here's what dinner looked like when your life depended on calories per ounce. The infamous meat and noodle brick. Issued as part of the K ration, this block of compressed meat, pasta, and salt wasn't food in the traditional sense, it was survival in a box. Designed for soldiers on the move, these dehydrated rations could last through mud, rain, and shellfire, waiting for a little boiling water and a brave stomach. When rehydrated, assuming you had water, heat, and time, it transformed into a lukewarm slurry of salted beef shreds and gummy noodles. If you didn't have time, you just gnawed it dry like a protein-packed dog biscuit. It didn't taste good, but it filled you up, sort of. In the field, the goal wasn't flavor, it was fuel. And meat and noodle bricks packed enough protein and fat to keep a man marching, shooting, and hopefully making it home. Soldiers joked that it tasted like compressed depression, but they ate it anyway because there wasn't anything else. These bricks weren't cooked with love, they were engineered for war. Army goulash with egg noodles was one of those meals that sounded better than it looked. Picture a big vat of elbow macaroni or egg noodles swimming in a reddish gravy, usually made from tomato powder, water, and bits of mystery meat that claimed to be beef. It was all tossed together in field kitchens or makeshift mess halls and dished out with a big metal spoon onto dented trays. It wasn't Hungarian by any stretch, but the name goulash gave it a certain flair, maybe enough to distract from the fact that it was mostly starch and salt. Still, after a day of marching or digging foxholes, soldiers didn't ask too many questions. The noodles filled your gut, the tomato sauce was warm, and the meat, well, the meat was there. Barely. Sometimes they'd get lucky and find a chunk that still had some chew. Other times, it was more like a meat-flavored suggestion. But it was easy to make in massive quantities, quick to serve, and didn't spoil fast. Add a stale cracker or two and maybe a swipe of peanut butter, and you had yourself a wartime feast, kind of. Dehydrated potato flakes with bacon grease might not sound like a real dish, but it was one of those battlefield creations born of desperation and a little ingenuity. The military issued powdered potato flakes for easy carb loading. They were light to carry and cooked up fast with just hot water. Alone, they tasted like wallpaper paste. But when bacon was on the breakfast menu earlier in the day, some clever soldiers saved the leftover grease in their mess kits. At dinner, they'd stir a spoonful of that precious, smoky fat into their reconstituted potatoes, and suddenly the bland mash took on a rich, salty flavor that almost passed for real comfort food. Some added crumbled crackers for texture. Others mixed in bits of powdered egg or Spam if they had any to spare. It wasn't elegant, but it was hot and filling, especially during cold nights in the field. You didn't need a stove, just a canteen of boiled water and some creativity. For soldiers stuck eating the same rations day in and day out, these little hacks brought a taste of something homemade, even when they were thousands of miles from home. Pork loaf in gelatin was one of the most polarizing canned meals ever issued to troops. It came in a tin, just like Spam. But that's where the resemblance ended. This was a smooth, rectangular slab of finely ground pork suspended in a pale, wobbly gelatin. It didn't smell bad exactly, but it didn't smell like food either. Some soldiers chilled it and sliced it like cold cuts, spreading it on crackers. Others heated it over a small flame, hoping the gelatin would melt into a kind of gravy. Spoiler, it didn't. The texture was dense, almost rubbery, and the flavor walked the line between salty and strangely sweet. The label said fully cooked, but that didn't mean appetizing. Still, it was protein and it kept you going. In fact, it kept you going for days. Most guys choked it down with black coffee or buried it under hot sauce. But there were always a few weirdos who loved it as is and hoarded their extra cans. Either way, it stuck in your memory, whether you liked it or not. Mutton stew with canned carrots was a hot meal with a long-lasting aftertaste, literally and figuratively. Served especially in Pacific outposts during World War II, it was meant to provide hearty calories in a humid, unforgiving climate. The meat, labeled mutton, was often stringy and oily with a distinct barnyard flavor that didn't win many fans. Tossed with overcooked canned carrots and floating in a thin gravy, it was served hot from large metal vats, slopped onto mess trays with a disheartening splat. The smell was strong, gamey and sour, and lingered even after you were done eating. Others swore it was goat. Either way, once it hit your stomach, it sat like a rock. Still, it was warm, it was food, and it wasn't hardtack. In the end, that was enough. Lard biscuits with military gravy were the closest thing to comfort food a soldier might find at a forward base. The biscuits were simple: flour, salt, baking powder, and a generous scoop of lard or bacon grease instead of butter. They were dropped onto hot pans and baked until just cooked through, often dense and a little greasy. But paired with the military's version of gravy, a runny, pale sauce made from powdered milk, salt, and rehydrated meat drippings, they were oddly satisfying. The gravy didn't thicken the way real country gravy does, but it coated the biscuits enough to make them soft and flavorful. For soldiers raised on Southern cooking, this meal felt like a stolen moment of home. For everyone else, it was still better than eating cold Spam straight from the can. You could soak up the last of your coffee with a biscuit or squirrel one away for later. It was messy, simple, and utterly filling. And on a cold morning, it was something warm to eat that didn't come from a tin. SOS with Spam variation was the salty lifeline of many mess hall breakfasts. Traditionally, SOS, short for stuff on a shingle, was made with creamed chipped beef over toast. But when beef ran short or Spam was easier to come by, mess sergeants got creative. Thin slices of Spam were pan-fried until the edges curled, then drenched in a milky, peppered white sauce made from powdered milk and flour. The whole thing got ladled over stale toast or split biscuits, the shingle part of the deal. It was greasy, it was salty, and it stuck with you all morning long. Some soldiers doused it in hot sauce. Others just shoveled it in and kept moving. It wasn't pretty, but it was warm. And in a world where your next meal was never guaranteed to be hot, that mattered. Plus, there was something satisfying about eating a dish everyone else seemed to hate. That's how you knew it was doing its job. Canned fruit cocktail with powdered milk was dessert, military style. The fruit cocktail, canned and syrupy, was a rainbow of diced pears, peaches, and the occasional maraschino cherry floating in sweet water. It was often paired with powdered milk, reconstituted into a vaguely creamy liquid that tried its best to imitate fresh dairy. Soldiers would mix the two together in mess cups or trays, letting the milk coat the fruit like a low-effort ambrosia. On hot days, if the cans had been chilled in a stream or in the shade, this dish was practically gourmet by Army standards. Some troops skipped the milk and drank the syrup. Others stirred in instant oatmeal or crackers to make it feel more like a pudding. It was sweet, it was cold, and it didn't come in a square tin, which made it a rare treat. For many, it was the one thing they looked forward to when lining up in the mess line, even if it was just for 5 spoonfuls of diced fruit and a dream. Wieners and beans in tomato sauce were the unofficial comfort food of field rations. Soldiers got them hot if the mess kitchen had time, but they were just as often eaten cold, straight from the can, especially in foxholes or on long marches. The beans were sweet and soft, soaked in a tangy tomato sauce. The wieners, more like little sausage links, were greasy, salty, and always a bit rubbery. But when you were cold, hungry, and homesick, this simple combo hit the spot. You could heat the can over a small flame or just jab a spoon in and call it a meal. Some guys stirred in cheese from other ration packs. Others crumbled crackers on top or added powdered onion for kick. It was hearty, easy to eat, and required no prep, perfect for exhausted troops with no time to cook. It might not have been gourmet, but it was warm, familiar, and just nostalgic enough to feel like something your mom might have made on a lazy Sunday. Rice and raisin skillet porridge was a warm breakfast made from odds and ends in the ration box. Soldiers took dry rice, rehydrated it with hot water or powdered milk, and stirred in a handful of raisins or other dried fruit. The result was a mildly sweet porridge that stuck to your ribs and helped you face another cold morning. Sometimes it was spiced with cinnamon if a care package happened to include it. Other times, guys would crumble in dry crackers or C-ration cookies for texture. It wasn't flashy, but it was hot, simple, and surprisingly satisfying, especially if you were tired of powdered eggs. Some called it rice pudding on the run. Others just appreciated that it didn't come in a can. It could be cooked quickly over a mess fire, using just a pan and a spoon, making it a favorite among early rising troops and night guards who needed something warm before sunrise. It filled your belly, and sometimes even your heart. Barley soup with salt crackers was a bare-bones meal, but one that warmed you up from the inside. Made with water, dried barley, bouillon cubes, and sometimes carrots or onion powder, it was a thin soup with just enough substance to count as food. Occasionally, leftover meat scraps were tossed in, bits of Spam, beef, or even canned chicken if supplies allowed. The soup was ladled into metal cups or bowls, and soldiers would break salt crackers over the top for crunch. It was bland, but comforting in its own way. The barley thickened as it cooked, turning the watery base into something more like a stew if you were patient. It was the kind of meal you ate slowly, savoring each bite, because you didn't know when your next hot dish would come. Not glamorous, not fancy, but it was warm, filling, and made you feel just a little bit human, something no ration bar could ever do. Fried bologna may not sound like war food, but for many soldiers it became a fast favorite. When you're working with thin meat rations and limited equipment, simplicity rules. A mess tin, a little heat, and a slice of processed bologna could create a warm, greasy slice of something that felt like home. But it was the rehydrated onions that really made this feel like a real dish. Dried flakes tossed in a bit of hot water from a canteen cup, stirred into life and added to sizzling meat, gave just enough flavor to remind you of dinner back in the States. If you had access to some stale white bread or even a ration biscuit, you had a sandwich worth savoring, even if you were sitting in mud. Fried bologna with rehydrated onions wasn't luxurious, but it was hot, fast, and salty. And in those conditions, that counted for everything. It wasn't gourmet, but it was a hot meal that felt like a win. Canned ox tongue with mustard powder was one of those rations that made you pause before digging in. Tongue isn't a cut many people go for today, but when you're far from home and looking for protein, you don't argue. The meat came packed in gelatinous broth, shaped into a slab, and once boiled or heated in its can, it turned tender and oddly rich. The trick was slicing it thin and using the dry mustard powder packet, usually included as a seasoning option, to give it some kind of tang. It wasn't pretty, and the texture could get to you if you thought about it too hard. But if you closed your eyes and imagined a deli counter instead of a muddy trench, it just about worked. Some soldiers swore by it, Others traded it away at the first opportunity. Still, when heated properly and seasoned well, it was edible, and that was good enough. In a world where canned meat ruled the day, ox tongue stood out as one of the more unusual yet oddly dignified rations. When potatoes were in short supply, turnips stepped up to the plate, though not always to applause. These sturdy root vegetables were mashed in bulk to fill bellies, often cooked down with margarine or whatever butter substitute was available. If the cook was generous, you might even get a dollop of bacon grease stirred in for a bit of savory depth. The result was a pale, slightly bitter mash that wasn't trying to fool anyone, but still did the job. In cold weather or lean times, turnips kept the troops going. They didn't spoil quickly, they were easy to transport, and when served steaming hot in a tin mess tray, they warmed more than just your stomach. Not everyone was a fan. Some swore off turnips forever after their service. But for others, that earthy flavor still stirs memories of camaraderie, cold nights, and quiet meals shared around a makeshift fire. Turnip mash wasn't a treat. It was a testament to making do with what you had. The peanut butter and jelly powder sandwich wasn't anyone's idea of a comfort food, but it was a field-ready option that got the job done. Instead of fresh spreads, troops were issued dry powdered versions of peanut butter and jelly, sealed in foil pouches to last through anything. To make it edible, you'd mix the powders with water in the palm of your hand or a mess tin until it resembled something spreadable. The results were often gritty and a little off in color, but surprisingly sweet and packed with protein. You'd smear the mixture on dry crackers or compressed ration bread, slap them together, and eat while walking or on watch. It was sticky, crumbly, and left a mess on your fingers, but it was also something familiar, even nostalgic. In the chaos of war, a fake PB&J sandwich gave you a second to remember lunchboxes and lazy Saturdays. It wasn't great, but it was good enough to keep spirits up in the middle of nowhere. Bully beef and crackers was a dish with history. Passed down from the British, this canned corned beef became a staple for American troops during joint operations. The meat was dense, salty, and gelatinous, straight from the can, far from appetizing to look at. But when you were cold, hungry, and short on options, it delivered fat and protein in spades. Paired with dry, nearly unbreakable crackers, it made for a meal that stuck with you, both in memory and in your gut. Some soldiers tried to fry the beef in their mess kits to crisp it up. Others just ate it cold. Either way, the dish was filling and easy to carry. The saltiness helped replace what you sweated out in the field. Not everyone loved it, and plenty swore it off after service, but it was dependable. In war, that means more than taste. Bully beef and crackers might not bring a smile, but it got the job done. Navy bean soup with fatback was a warm, familiar meal that helped many new recruits survive their first winter in uniform. In big naval mess halls, this soup could be made in massive vats with simple ingredients: dried white beans, a few chopped carrots, and hunks of salty fatback for flavor. The beans were boiled until soft, the fatback melted into the broth, and sometimes a bit of onion or garlic was added if supplies allowed. Served steaming with a slice of dark bread, it was a meal that filled the belly and kept you going through cold sea duty or long drills. It wasn't fancy, but it was comfort food for a generation of sailors and Marines. The smell alone could draw a line down the mess hall. For many, it was the first taste of military life, and one that lingered long after they'd left the service. A bowl of Navy bean soup might not win awards, but it kept the cold out and the ranks full. Dried apple rings in syrup weren't exactly dessert, but they tried. These chewy slices of dehydrated apple were brought back to life by soaking them in hot water, preferably with a spoonful of sugar from your ration packet. The result was a warm, sweet, vaguely fruity mixture that could be eaten plain or spooned over dry biscuits. Some mess cooks got creative and added cinnamon or canned milk powder to make it feel more like pie filling. Most of the time, though, it was just sweetened apples in a tin cup, eaten with a mess spoon after a salty meal. But after weeks of canned meat and dry crackers, even a hint of fruit felt like a blessing. The syrup clung to everything, leaving a sticky trace of sugar on fingers and gear. But nobody complained. In fact, it was one of the few dessert options that actually lifted morale. It wasn't fresh pie, but for a soldier far from home, it was close enough. Vegetable stew with canned sausage was the ultimate mix-and-match mess hall meal. You took whatever canned vegetables were available, usually carrots, peas, and potatoes, and simmered them in hot water with sliced rounds of canned sausage. The result was a thick, warming stew that could stretch to feed a whole squad. The sausage added fat and salt, giving the bland vegetables some much-needed flavor. Sometimes, if luck held out, you'd get a piece of dried onion or even a few grains of rice mixed in. It was far from gourmet, but it was hot, hearty, and colorful, a rare thing in ration food. Troops looked forward to it on cold days, when the warmth of the broth seeped into your bones. It tasted like something your grandma might have made from leftovers, and while nobody ever wrote home about it, they didn't turn it down either. Vegetable stew with canned sausage might have been made from scraps, but it filled a void that went beyond hunger. Cold cheese spread on pilot crackers was as bare bones as it sounds, but for many soldiers, it was a lifesaver. The spread was a processed cheese product sealed in tiny cans or squeeze tubes, designed to last forever and be edible straight from the pack. No heating required, no prep, just peel open and scoop. The pilot crackers were dry, dense, and had the texture of a roof shingle, but they were sturdy and filling. Together, they made a no-fuss snack or light lunch that could be eaten on the move, in the dark, or under fire. The cheese wasn't great, chalky and salty with a strange aftertaste, but it stuck to the crackers and kept your stomach quiet. Some troops added hot sauce, others just held their breath and ate. But when time was tight and cooking wasn't an option, this combo kept you going. It was never about taste. It was about staying on your feet. Tinned stewed tomatoes with pasta shells offered a splash of color in a sea of beige military meals. The tomatoes came in cans, bright, acidic, and stewed with a bit of garlic or onion if you were lucky. The pasta shells were pre-cooked and sealed in vacuum packs or rehydrated in boiling water when conditions allowed. Mix the two together, add a dash of pepper or a packet of hot sauce, and you had something resembling a hot meal. It was tangy, warm, and easy on the stomach. For soldiers used to the taste of meat and salt, it was a welcome change, vegetarian, even if by accident. The texture wasn't always great, with the pasta turning mushy or the tomatoes breaking apart into soup. But when heated together and eaten from a canteen cup, it delivered warmth and sustenance with a little bit of flavor. In the long list of wartime meals, this one ranked higher than most. It wasn't just edible, it was almost enjoyable. Cottage cheese being used as a substitute for meat is another factor of cooking that you probably never thought was possible, but is actually well documented. Even the Department of Agriculture agrees that it is a pretty rocking substitute for meat as it contains a lot of protein. And when you need to get your macros in on a budget, you cannot be complaining about the source. Sure, everyone would love to fulfill their battle-action protagonist fantasies of chowing down trays and trays of meat, but we only need so many grams of protein in a day to make a bulk. Dry curd cottage cheese especially contains more protein per pound than beef or lamb, and only chicken and veal beat it at that game. It seems there is a lot of cooking know-how that can be picked up from Americans living in those times. Powdered milk was there to step in when fresh milk wasn't an option. Powdered milk was a marvel of food science, transforming surplus dairy into a shelf-stable product that didn't require refrigeration, a crucial feature for families without electric ice boxes during the Great Depression. Technically, a few scoops of powder whisked into the water made a liquid that resembled milk. The taste was more chalky than creamy, and the fresh stuff had a richer flavor. But powdered milk wasn't about luxury. It was about survival. It was a base for soups, sauces, and baked goods, making it one of the most versatile Depression-era pantry items. Families with children found powdered milk especially important because it meant kids got a steady supply of calcium and protein, even when fresh dairy was not available. It was also affordable, which meant it became a favorite among relief programs, which distributed it to struggling households. Powdered milk was a lifeline for families living far from the nearest dairy farm in rural areas where refrigeration was scarce. Today, powdered milk is used mostly for emergencies and backpacking trips, but it played a big role during the Great Depression. It was a symbol of ingenuity and resilience, taking something as simple as milk and turning it into a survival tool in a world of scarce resources. Canned luncheon meat was like Spam's less famous but more generic cousin during the post-war days. It was another affordable protein source that was readily available everywhere. It was used in sandwiches, salads, or simply eaten on its own when no other resource was around. It was also a good choice for big households when wallets were too tight back in the day. It was an instant hit in the States and made its way to other parts of the world before it became a pantry staple in Europe too. I mean, what's not to love about a cheap, easy-to-make meat option that's easy to store and prepare? But let's be honest, it's probably best left in the can. Unless you're a fan of processed meat flavor, I know I'm not. So, here's a ration that was actually heavily politically charged as well. What do you think happens when you introduce canned sauerkraut, a heavily German meal, in a time when anti-German sentiment is soaring sky high in the hearts and minds of the people? Some think this was a deliberate attempt by the American government to sway public opinion towards the takes they wanted. Sort of a try at radicalizing them by reminding them who was responsible for their current state. To promote American unity, the government even tried to get people to start calling sauerkraut something entirely different. Now it was to be known as Liberty cabbage, and this was a way for them to take the parts of German culture that they liked while distancing people overall from the image of it that already existed. This was a European German meal, and that wasn't what they wanted it to look like because it was also a fantastic ration. Hence, you saw the term Liberty cabbage being plastered all over newspapers and ads, as well as packaging. Dried navy beans are the perfect meal when you're on a budget and want something filling and endlessly adaptable. These humble legumes were a lifesaver during the Great Depression, when meat was out of reach, providing protein and sustenance. Their small size and mild flavor made them a good base for soups and stews, baked beans, and bean patties. Navy beans were ridiculously economical as well. That single bag could feed a family for days, especially if you add rice, cornbread, or whatever odds and ends were in the pantry. They lasted practically forever on the shelf, and that made them an excellent stockpile item for lean times. The best part? These little powerhouses were nutritional dynamos, packed with fiber, protein, and iron, just what you needed to keep energy up when work was hard and food was scarce. Navy beans were transformed into savory dishes seasoned with salt pork and sweetened bean pies that were surprisingly tasty. They weren't exactly exciting, but they were reliable, and that's what mattered. Navy beans are still a staple in many kitchens today, but back then they were a symbol of survival. Depression-era families depended on them, simple, sturdy, and essential, one bowl at a time. There is nothing like taking advantage of nature's bounty with sweet dishes like apple brown betties, and if the subject is how a pie can put you in the right mood, then it is criminal not to talk about these. Usually made with apples or pears, berries, and other seasonal common fruit, the fruit would be baked, and layers of sweetened crumbs would hold it all together. The dish was the textbook definition of comfort food, and it screamed grandma's cooking in a time where many people did not know if they would see their family again. Lots of folks were suffering from malnutrition and hunger, but pies like this, which are easy to make with natural ingredients, were a blessing. Apple brown betties are not as widely consumed today as they were during the World War, but back in the day, people found solace in the dessert they could make with whatever little they had. The recipe is commendable and might taste weird to us today because of our modern tastes. The Great Depression was no reason to skip gelatin packets, which were pantry staples and culinary alchemy in powdered form. Gelatin was a cook's best friend because of its uncanny ability to turn liquid into solid, allowing it to stretch ingredients farther than anyone thought possible. Why was gelatin so popular during the Depression? First of all, it was cheap and easy to store. The packets could sit on the shelf indefinitely, waiting for the day when a family had to pull something out of the cupboard, something that looked like a real meal. Gelatin was even used to make mock recipes that looked like expensive foods. so families could enjoy a taste of luxury on a shoestring budget. In the 1930s, gelatin was a sign of ingenuity and resourcefulness, but today it conjures up images of wobbly Jell-O molds at family gatherings. Its culinary heyday may be over, but gelatin is a nostalgic reminder of how far creativity can go when times are hard. There's no better way of repurposing leftover mashed potatoes than making potato cakes. It's a name given to various shaped potato dishes around the world, including a patty of hashed potatoes, a fried patty of mashed potato, a fried and battered slice of potato, or a flatbread made with mashed potato and flour. These fried patties were crispy on the outside and soft on the inside, often served as a side dish or breakfast item. In northern England and some states in Australia, a thin slice of potato that was battered and deep-fried was called a potato scallop. In Australia and New Zealand, the terms potato cake, potato flip, and potato fritter were used instead. They were often flavored with onions, herbs, or cheese and served with a dollop of sour cream, or alongside other breakfast items like eggs and bacon. With the rise of hash browns, potato cakes are barely missed today. But if you ever feel like cooking something comforting, I say give this one a try. Another powdered mix that got really popular was all the kinds of lemonade mixes that started popping out during this stretch of the 20th century too. By 1927, you had the first ever Kool-Aid, courtesy of Edwin Perkins. It didn't really get widespread appeal until the war, since it was right during this time that it became a part of those food relief campaigns. Even by the company itself, it was always marketed as one of the cheapest drinks you could get. Plus, toddlers were massive suckers for those colorful packets they always had on display at stores. If you want to go a bit further than the conventional, then you have a lot of local lemonade brand mixes to look forward to as well. There were all kinds of people who were attempting their best to try to get more vitamin C because the Dust Bowl had also happened shortly before the Second War. Combined with how poorly people were living, it meant that skin issues were pretty much a regular fact of life for people. Barley is not glamorous, but it was a culinary workhorse during the Great Depression. This ancient grain was a go-to ingredient for families who wanted to fill empty stomachs without emptying their wallets. Its biggest strength was its versatility. It gave soups and stews heartiness, porridge a stick-to-your-ribs breakfast, and even found its way into bread and dumplings. Depression-era dishes got a comforting depth from their chewy texture and nutty flavor, proving that simple ingredients could still be satisfying. Barley was a resilient crop, growing well on poor soil and surviving harsh weather, which farmers liked because it meant they could count on it to grow even in uncertain times. It is stored beautifully once harvested, good for months in cool, dry places. Barley thus became a staple of the pantry for rural families and urban households alike. Barley wasn't just about food, it was about community. In hard times, neighbors gathered to share recipes and tips for stretching their barley supply, creating a sense of community. Barley is today a niche ingredient, celebrated for its health benefits and rustic charm. During the Depression, it was a survival tool, showing that even the most humble grains could keep a family together through the worst of days. Black pudding used to be one of the most precious desserts of America that people would chow down on every Sunday. And despite those simple joys being out of reach, people wanted to try their hand at recreating the taste and thrill of a black pudding with what was there on hand. Thus we had mock black pudding. This typically involved porridge oats or oatmeal, with thyme as the primary seasoning. If you had butter, then even better, but margarine worked just fine to give it thickness. What you had was something that did not truly capture the taste of a good black pudding pie, but was still awfully delightful to eat. It makes sense why people would go back to the original when it became a reasonable idea, though. Canned liver wasn't the most comfortable food, but it was a lifeline during the Great Depression. This pantry staple was a nutritional powerhouse, packed with protein, vitamins, and minerals, and didn't require refrigeration, a godsend for families without access to fresh meat. It was metallic and mushy, but on a day when every calorie mattered, canned liver did the trick. The canned liver was a surprisingly versatile food. It could be spread on bread for a quick meal, mixed into casseroles, or fried up with onions to make something almost palatable. Its rich flavor, sometimes too rich, made it a cheap way to feed a family because a little went a long way. Canned liver can even be blended into meatloaf or meatballs, stretching meals without sacrificing protein for those willing to get creative. Canned liver is a rare thing today, but its legacy lives on as a symbol of frugality and resilience. It wasn't about taste or presentation for Depression-era families, it was about survival. A tin of canned liver in the cupboard was evidence that even the most unappealing ingredients could keep you alive and give you hope when things got the toughest. Canned ham was like the instant ramen of foods back in the post-war days. In 1940, it started gaining traction as the miracle meat during World War II. It was also transported as an aid to Great Britain and the Soviet Union. Canned ham was nothing fancy, which was the best thing about this meal. It was perfect for busy households or people on the run. Plus, its long shelf life was like the cherry on top. Back in the day, this was a convenience food dream come true. No fuss, no muss, just a whole lot of ham. But let's be real. Fresh ham is where it's at. Unless you're stranded on a desert island, I'd stick to the deli counter. We don't need to punish ourselves with canned meat anymore, which is why this dinner has become a part of ancient history. Powdered cheese mixes, on the other hand, were a different kind of relief for the masses. While basic everyday ingredients like vegetable cubes and dried noodles restored that nostalgia of eating a good hearty dinner when people came back home from work, they weren't exactly the kind of flavors people associated with being laid up in bed, all comfortable eating your favorite little snack. Cheese was always involved in most of the comfort food that ever got popular in America, but dairy and cheese in general became extremely hard for most people to even dare to think about getting. How could you afford to spend money on things like cheese when people have been eating lentils the next day and not even a big generous helping of them, like just scraps? That's the way most people were living. If you think I might be exaggerating it, then you have to understand, America had been put through the ringer a bit before the Second World War as well. The effects of the first still hadn't fully resolved. Brands like Kraft really made their name during this time too, because it was their macaroni and cheese mix, which first came out in 1937, that really made waves for people during this time. Mock cuisine in general really saw its heyday during the harsh times of rationing, especially with all the things that were famously eaten before times got so bad, like brain. People wanted more of their favorites, even if they had to compromise in some way. And things like mock brains would become really popular as a result. Known for being quite heavy on the seasoning and being laced with fat, they incorporated basic spices like hickory smoke, paprika, and garlic. People would typically have it with a tomato sauce if they could spare the ingredients, and it definitely scratched that itch that lots of US meat lovers were having around the nation. Dried peas may be the wallflowers of the legume world, but they were the unsung heroes of many kitchens during the Great Depression. These little green powerhouses were tiny, nutrient-packed, and incredibly cheap, just the kind of food that families could stretch their food budgets as far as possible. In particular, split peas shone brightly as the star ingredient in hearty soups and stews. A handful of vegetables, maybe a scrap of salt pork, simmered with a pot of water made a meal that could warm bellies and spirits. The peas themselves were a solid dose of protein for those who couldn't afford meat and helped families stay nourished when times were tough. A near-infinite shelf life also came from dried peas. They could be stored in jars or cloth sacks and could last for years, making them a reliable choice for households that wanted to prepare for lean months. Peas were often grown by rural families, which dried and preserved them for the winter, or city dwellers went to market stalls to get their supply. Dried peas have been overshadowed by the flashier ingredient, but their legacy remains. They remind us that sometimes the simplest foods are the most dependable, feeding families through economic storms with a few handfuls of green perseverance. While we're on the topic of ham, this next dish added a fruity twist to it. Yep, we're talking about ham and banana hollandaise. Sweet banana, salty ham, and rich, creamy hollandaise sauce. Some might call it adventurous, others might call it a crime against food. This dish made a lot of buzz in the 1970s, and bananas have never appeared more out of their element ever since. It was featured in McCall's Great American Recipe Card collection in 1973 and took the world by storm due to its uniqueness. The hollandaise was a creamy sauce, first born in France and was originally known as sauce Isigny, named after a small town in Normandy famous for its butter and cream. This dish really proves that in a time of desperation, anyone will eat anything. But hey, at least it was memorable. During the Second World War, another hobby had been acquired by the mass public, and it was actually crucial at keeping them alive. Lots of people began foraging for dried mushrooms. See, it wasn't a hobby per se for people who were living in rural areas and on the outskirts of society. They had pretty much been very used to already foraging for things and also got ahead of the game when the trend first took over. People foraged for all kinds of reasons, but the chief one among everyone's list was always that it was free. It was the best thing to do and the best thing to look for during the war too, because mushrooms, more than anything else they were so good at doing, they could add an incredible amount of flavor to whatever it was you were making. This meant that people could enjoy meals once in a while too. I know you might have expected a practical reason like how they grew around the environment, the many nutritional benefits of mushrooms, or how long they last. But honestly, people were tired of always thinking about the pros and cons of something. Being logical is an effort, not a trait, you know? Takes energy. Energy was something people desperately lacked because they barely had any sources of joy in their day, and the fact that they could get morels, porcini, even shiitake mushrooms every once in a while definitely cheered them up during their day. People that grew up during World War II will know that mixing sawdust with bread to fortify it so that your supply would last twice as long is not quite the urban myth it is made out to be today, but rather a sad fact of a dark time that people would prefer to leave in the past. This was something born purely out of necessity, and a lack of basic necessities like flour. Since it was becoming so scarce across America, people's supplies of bread were running out fast and often. Bread was the only thing families had to eat too. With even that comfort gone, people took to mixing sawdust, which you could even taste in the bread. In some cases, it made the bread go bad faster, such as people when used too much of it. But in most other appliances of this technique, it worked as a filler when nothing else could be used as one. This would also set up a trend of consuming fiber in the 70s, even though most companies used cellulose fiber that was made from sawdust. So it actually does have quite a history in America. Hominy was a humble kitchen staple during the Great Depression, and it stretched far and wide. Hominy puffed up into soft, chewy nuggets made by soaking dried corn kernels in lye. Yes, lye, and as versatile as they were filling. Hominy may not have been glamorous, but it did the job. Hominy made its way into soups, casseroles, and even as a side dish fried. A texture party, it gave simple meals a satisfying chew. It became the base for Southern favorites like grits for those who could afford a little extra seasoning. It was a hearty, starchy savior on lean days for everyone else. Hominy was often prepared in large batches, which they dried and stored for future use. This wasn't just food, it was an investment for the long term, so you wouldn't go hungry. Making hominy wasn't exactly convenient, but it was worth it when food supplies were low. Hominy is still a staple in some cuisines, but it's long since faded from everyday American tables. But for those who lived through the Great Depression, this unassuming corn product was a lifeline. And once again, necessity is the mother of culinary invention. Corned beef hash was pretty much a mix of corned beef, potatoes, and onions. Corned beef, also known as salt beef, was popular in most Commonwealth countries during both the World Wars. Although the exact origin of corned beef is unknown, it most likely came about when people began preserving meat through salt curing. This dish was a practical way to use up leftovers and stretch food supplies, and was often served for breakfast or dinner. The best part? It was very filling at a very low cost. It is also the ultimate hangover cure before, or at least it was before, people discovered avocado toast. But let's be real, nothing beats a good plate of hash when you're craving something satisfying. So besides just canned meat and the kinds of things people were out there hunting, there was also potted meat. What was potted meat? Good question, dear viewer. It's one I asked immediately too. You actually make this by cooking some really well-grounded meat that was then repackaged, sealed, and sold in a jar or a can of fat and broth and jelly. Basically, it meant that people were able to get a long-lasting source of meat that could suit everyone's household. After all, not everyone was equipped and loaded with a fridge to work with. Not everyone had a basement that would get cold enough in the winters either. Stuff like potted meat, canned meat. All of this was essential because it applied to more or less everyone. Why was it called potted meat in specific, though? Well, when you would prepare this kind of meat, you would make a lot of use of a pot. It was common to put that meat into the pot and cover it with fat. Then you would seal it and preserve it. Things like these were how most families lived during the World War. Bubble and squeak was something that completely fit the situations most people would find themselves in during the war, because this dish is all about the leftovers. Usually, Sunday dinner's leftovers would be used in a bubble and squeak to make sure nothing went to waste. Plus, people would definitely take that sentiment to heart when it came to holiday dinners where there were enough things left to constitute at least 2 or 3 meals the next day. Usually, this dish is made with potatoes and cabbage and is fried, so it goes properly and amazingly with some potato flotties or other items on the list. Maybe you can take a note from people's books the next time you think you have nothing to eat, but plenty of things still left. For a generation that lived through the Depression, saltine crackers were Depression-era superheroes in disguise as mere squares of humdrum dough. Saltines stretched scarce ingredients further, providing the fill-in-the-gaps when bread, flour, or even meat ran short. Break them into milk for breakfast? Done. Canned goods? Layer them with them for a makeshift casserole? Absolutely. A rare treat. Toast them with cheese? Heaven on a plate. Saltines were cheap, long-lasting, and endlessly useful, so families stockpiled them. Because they were shelf-stable, they stayed fresh for months, a game-changer when grocery trips were out of the question. Saltines were also a change in texture and flavor from food that got monotonous, which was often the case during the Depression. They were neutral, so whatever was on hand could be put on them. Peanut butter, jelly, or leftover gravy. Today, they're often overshadowed by their fancier cracker cousins, but saltines still have a nostalgic charm. In the 1930s, they were more than a snack. They were a survival tool, and sometimes the simplest things were the biggest things. Liverwurst and onion sandwiches were once a lunchtime favorite. Liverwurst or liver sausage is a kind of sausage made from liver, so it was the perfect meal for when no part of the animal could go to waste. There were very limited meats available during the World Wars, and people had to use whatever they could find, including livers and hearts. Liverwurst was often spread thickly on rye bread and topped with thinly sliced onions. This sandwich was very popular in Europe and different parts of South America such as Argentina and Chile. I don't know about you, but the combination of iron-rich liver and pungent onion doesn't sit right with me. It was like a flavor explosion in your mouth, but not in a good way. I'm pretty sure this sandwich was invented as a punishment, but you know, people really had to make do with whatever they could find back in the day, and this dish was just a result of that experiment. If you asked me if I think rabbit is a fine dining experience or easily available enough that it would work towards relieving national hunger and food shortages, I'd lean towards the former. But the truth may surprise you. Canned rabbit was actually a massive part of the military ration effort for many countries, and our dear old America wasn't any different. After all, across the globe, one thing was true about rabbits. They were an extremely good source of lean meat, and more importantly, there was also a point to keeping a good amount of rabbits. They reproduced pretty quickly, and what you hear about them is grounded in reality. While that might be a slightly jarring thought to have about your food during the war, thinking like that was necessary. It meant that rabbits were really well suited to the kind of environment the war had created, and canned meats like corned beef and Spam were sometimes made entirely out of the lean meat of the various rabbits you could find on land. Hunting them for sustenance also became a popular thing once again, and a lot of people even began to learn to hunt as a result of wanting to provide for their family by at least being able to take advantage of the local game and wildlife. It was a free and tasty source of nutrition, and that wasn't something people were going to miss out on. Shortages were extremely common right up to before Pearl Harbor and especially after it. This is what led to things like Woolton pie dominating the mainstream, even though the dish would probably not see the light of day in normal circumstances. It is just that things like pies, loaves, pizzas, etc. had all become unattainable desires that were out of the public's grasp, more or less. Something had to be done, though, because not only did people need to be fed, they needed to be reminded of why eating good food is one of life's best joys. A hot, nice meal can do so much for a person's soul in times of conflict and uncertainty. And Woolton pies, despite being made entirely out of vegetables, not only gave your body the health boost it needed, but they felt comforting to share with your family. If this march down memory lane made you hungry, drop your own ration memories in the comments. Give us a thumbs and subscribe.